My name is Natalie Vance. I'm 42 years old. I hold the position of Naval Intelligence Officer for the United States Navy, carrying a clearance level so elevated that even my own mother has no idea what my work actually involves. Last Saturday evening was meant to be the most distinguished moment of my professional life. I was receiving a promotion to captain, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, every member of my family showed up. My mother flew in from Montana. My Aunt Beth, a woman who rarely leaves her lakeside home, wore pearls for the first time since we buried my father. And even my brother, Christopher Vance, a field agent with the Navy Criminal Investigative Service, stood quietly at the back of the room, stone-faced and unreadable. I should have recognized something was wrong the moment he smiled at me. The event was held in a private banquet hall in Annapolis. Dress uniforms, service medals, champagne flutes. The room shimmered with tradition. Men and women I had served alongside across multiple continents lifted their glasses in my direction. My commanding officer spoke warmly about my discretion, my loyalty, my 15 years of flawless service under classified directives. I had never been fond of speeches, but I smiled regardless because it was nearly finished. Just as I stepped forward to receive the ceremonial insignia box, something I'd spent half a lifetime working toward, Christopher walked onto the platform without being invited. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked out at the crowd and said, "Stop this ceremony. She's a fraud." Gasps swept through the room. I heard glasses rattle against tables. A woman in the audience muttered, "What is he doing?" And then, as if on cue, Christopher produced his badge and a pair of silver handcuffs. He turned toward me. "Lieutenant Commander Natalie Jane Vance," he said, his voice sharp and precise. "You're under arrest for impersonating a naval officer under a falsified identity." I didn't speak. I didn't blink. I let him turn me around and fasten the cuffs behind my back. My mother screamed. Somewhere near the buffet table, someone dropped a wine glass. A Marine colonel shouted, "Is this real?" Nobody moved. Christopher didn't waver. He held up a manila envelope. Inside were printed documents and darkened photographs. "Her name isn't even Natalie Vance," he announced. "It's Natalie Jane Morgan, and she's been operating under forged credentials beneath a black flag clearance that doesn't exist." The room erupted in low murmurs and disbelief. My aunt clutched her chest. My cousin covered her child's ears. I kept my chin level and said nothing. I had witnessed this kind of scene before, just never from my own bloodline. Christopher guided me toward the center aisle. No one stopped him. Not the Admiral of Ceremonies, not the military attaché, not even the rear admiral seated in the third row. Because in that moment, nobody knew what to believe. And that was precisely what Christopher had counted on. Then it happened. The atmosphere shifted. Someone whispered, "Who is that?" At the far end of the ballroom, the double doors groaned open, and a man stepped through. No uniform, no medals, just a gray suit and a presence that silenced the entire room. He walked with a slight limp, but carried no cane. His hair was silver and trimmed to regulation length. His eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely unimpressed. My brother's hands went still. The man approached slowly, each step deliberate, and stopped only inches from where we stood. He looked directly at Christopher. Then, with a voice as heavy as a gavel, he spoke 6 words. "Get your hands off my wife." The room fell into absolute silence. My brother's expression shifted from smug confidence to confusion to raw terror. It took him a full 3 seconds to process what had been said. He looked at me, then at the man. "Your wife?" he stammered. The man gave a single nod. "I am Fleet Admiral Raymond Vance, former commander of the United States Pacific Fleet. And this woman is not only exactly who she claims to be. She has done more for this country than you will ever be permitted to know." Someone dropped their phone. A woman gasped. The event presenter sank back into her chair as though struck. Raymond stepped forward, unclipped the handcuffs from my wrists, and returned them calmly to Christopher. "And if you ever lay a hand on her again, not even your badge will shield you from what follows." My brother retreated a step. I remained silent. I didn't need to say a word, because every question that had previously filled that room now carried a completely different weight. How could I be married to a 5-star admiral? Why had no one known? Was everything Christopher said a fabrication, or something worse, a half-truth? Raymond wrapped his hand around mine. My fingers were cold. I hadn't even realized they were trembling. He turned to address the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, if this ceremony is concluded, then I suggest we begin the hearing. He led me out. Not another word was spoken, but as I walked past the rows of friends, family, and decorated strangers, something became clear to me. Something far more dangerous than betrayal had unfolded in that room. Someone had wielded truth as a weapon. And now the decision was mine, whether I would use silence as my shield. Because the people gathered in that hall weren't simply witnesses. They were the first to ever glimpse the real me. And they had no idea what that would cost them. They used to say I was born in Christopher's shadow. The photographs confirmed it. In every family picture, he stood at the center, chin raised, uniform pressed, medals earned through high school ROTC programs. I was the blur at the edge, the one with scraped knees, a book in hand, and eyes that never met the camera lens. Growing up in a military household meant expectations arrived standard issue. Order, excellence, discipline. But in our home, they all came bundled with one unspoken rule: be like Christopher. My mother never delivered that message with malice. She would fold laundry and casually remark, "Your brother always polished his boots before inspection." Or, "Christopher's drill sergeant said he had command potential." The line I heard most often, "Maybe if you smiled more, people wouldn't think you're so distant." Distant. That was her polite word for strange. But I wasn't strange. I was simply quiet. I observed things. I asked questions. I listened far more than I spoke. I had a gift for patterns, numbers, strategies, codes. While other children were playing kickball, I was studying military flight formations and working through encrypted puzzles from my father's old training manuals. But in a world that worshipped charisma and noise, silence was frequently misread as weakness. Christopher was textbook perfection, quarterback, honor student, prom king. He even volunteered to fold flags at veterans' funerals. By 16, he had already declared he would become a Navy officer and bring pride to the family. By 17, he had been accepted into the Naval Academy. At dinner, he led every conversation. I washed dishes. At church, people shook his hand. I stood behind my mother. He was the one destined for greatness. I was the daughter who read too much. I remember once, in 8th grade, I broke a state math record. I brought the certificate home, beaming with pride for the first time in weeks. My mother glanced up, gave a brief nod, and said, "That's nice, sweetie. Did you hear? Christopher had just been named captain of the debate team." And that was that. It wasn't that I despised him. I didn't. But somewhere between childhood and adolescence, my admiration had soured into something colder. He began talking down to me. Whenever I mentioned a new tactic I'd read in a counterinsurgency manual, he would smirk. Reading about war and living it aren't the same, Natalie. At 16, he caught me practicing rifle assembly in the garage. He shook his head and laughed. "Leave that to people who actually pass the physical." I said nothing. I always said nothing because I had already learned that arguing with Christopher was like punching a mirror. All it did was leave you with fragments of yourself. My father passed away before I turned 18. Lung cancer. Decades of military service couldn't protect him from what the war had left behind. At the funeral, Christopher delivered a flawless eulogy. I stood beside the casket and shed no tears. Not because I wasn't grieving, but because the grief had nowhere to go. Afterward, I found my mother sitting alone. She looked up at me and said, "Your brother made your father proud today." And just like that, she buried 2 men in the same breath. I enlisted quietly. No celebration, no send-off. I carved my own path, applied for intelligence, and finished in the top 3 of my class. But when the acceptance letter arrived, I told no one. Not Christopher, not my mother, not even myself in any real sense, because part of me still believed what they all did. That I was just the girl in the corner. A shadow. A ghost. And ghosts don't get parades. They simply learn to walk through walls unseen. And sometimes that's the only way they survive. I didn't tell anyone I had enlisted until the morning I shipped out. Not my mother, not Christopher, not even my closest friend from school. I packed light, one duffel bag, a notebook, and a secondhand copy of The Art of War. The only call I received that week was from a recruiter confirming my departure time. Boot camp didn't intimidate me. Silence had already instilled discipline. Rejection had already built resilience. And being invisible in my own home had already taught me how to vanish in plain sight. By the third week, I was flagged for a separate evaluation. They didn't explain why, only that I had scored exceptionally high in abstract logic, advanced coding, foreign language aptitude, and firearm simulation. I was moved to a separate compound. 6 months later, I was accepted into naval intelligence. No ceremony, no photographs. I signed a document that legally removed my presence from half the systems used to track military personnel. From that point forward, I belonged to the shadows. I carried 4 different operational identities, 3 temporary passports, and not a single social media profile. I have 4 names, I once told a fellow agent, 3 fake nationalities, and 0 birthday parties since 2009. He thought I was being funny. I wasn't. Over the years, I served across 12 countries on 5 continents. Everything from data surveillance to tactical recovery to weapons procurement. But the assignment that stayed with me, the one that still plays through my mind like a slow-burning film, took place in Lagos, Nigeria. A cargo ship had been hijacked off the coast. 5 hostages, 3 armed pirates, 1 demand: release our men or they die. We didn't negotiate. I was deployed with a coastal response team. From the deck of a low-profile naval vessel, I was positioned behind a scope, breathing through my diaphragm, counting the second between each wave slapping against the hull. At that distance, a human face becomes a pattern, a moving shadow behind shattered glass and flickering light. You don't register emotions, you calculate trajectories. 1 pirate held a child up to the window. I waited. The child blinked. The man shifted his hand. I squeezed the trigger. 1 shot, center mass. The hostage ran. We breached. I recovered the hard drive the pirates had been attempting to extract. Encrypted military data they didn't even know was traceable. We saved 4 lives. The 5th hostage had already been executed before our arrival. Still, the mission was classified a success. I was told, this is why we train ghosts, to make decisions that ordinary humans cannot. But ghosts don't receive medals. We receive silence. I flew back the following day, slept in a barracks 4 floors underground, ate alone, and not once did my family call. They didn't even know I had left the country. My mother sent me an email that week about a neighbor's wedding. She asked if I could make it to Montana for Thanksgiving. No mention of my deployment. No mention of the hostage crisis that had run across global headlines for 2 days straight. It was as though the Natalie they knew had been replaced, or worse, forgotten. But here's the thing about being forgotten. Eventually, you stop waiting to be remembered. So I leaned into it. I became the kind of officer they assigned to the Black Files. The kind of woman who could vanish inside embassies, speak 3 dialects of Arabic, and identify a target in a crowded marketplace without anyone noticing. I stopped searching for family and blood. I began finding it in code names and encrypted channels, in the stillness before a strike, in the rare smile of a teammate who understood what it meant to inhabit a world where failure costs lives and success couldn't be spoken aloud. So when people ask me now if I ever felt lonely, I don't lie. I tell them the truth. Loneliness is manageable. Being invisible to people who claim to love you, that takes practice. And I had mastered it. I had mastered the art of being a ghost, because sometimes the only way to truly serve is to disappear. I arrived the day before the ceremony. My flight touched down in D.C. just after noon, but I didn't drive straight to Annapolis. I sat in a rental car for nearly 30 minutes at a rest stop just off Route 50, tried to remember how to walk back into a house that had never quite felt like home. My mother's voice was the first thing to greet me. "There she is," she said, as if I'd stepped out for groceries rather than been gone for 2 years. She pulled me into a hug, brief, one-armed, faintly smelling of cinnamon and Vicks. Her hair was grayer than I remembered, or perhaps I had simply never looked closely before. The house was tidier than it used to be, sterile, as though it had been scrubbed of memories. The dining room table was already set for 8. Polished silverware, folded napkins, a roast in the oven. Even Christopher was there early, standing by the window, scrolling through his phone. He didn't look up when I entered. Didn't speak either. Still running on that Navy schedule? Huh. My mother joked. Always on time, I replied with a small, controlled smile. No one asked about my flight or my work. No one mentioned the promotion ceremony scheduled for the following evening. Instead, my Aunt Beth pointed at my left hand and said, "Still no ring." My mother followed without missing a beat. "You're not getting any younger, Nat. You know that, right?" I said nothing. Took a sip of water. The glass was chipped. Christopher finally glanced my way. His smile was thin and tight. "Still working overseas?" he asked. "Here and there." I answered. "You know," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "some people find it odd that you're never in one place long enough to appear on any record." I held his gaze. Some people live on record. Others live in service. He didn't reply. The tension settled like dust. Mom broke it with her familiar fallback. "You two used to be so close. Remember when you taught her how to tie a square knot, Chris?" Christopher didn't laugh. Neither did I. Dinner was mechanical. Roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a side of thinly veiled questions. "So, are you seeing anyone? Where are you living these days? What exactly is it you do again?" I gave vague answers, polite, nonspecific. I had learned long ago that the more detail you offer people who have already made up their minds about you, the more ammunition you hand them. "Still no kids, huh?" my cousin asked over dessert. "Just the world's secrets," I replied. Only the dog seemed genuinely glad to see me. A golden retriever named Maxwell, who curled up at my feet and refused to move for the rest of the evening. He was old, slow, and partially deaf, but somehow more perceptive than everyone else in the room. At one point, Christopher stood and disappeared into the garage. He was gone for nearly 20 minutes. When he returned, his collar was slightly damp. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Just getting the wine," he replied. But his eyes didn't match the answer. Something was lurking behind them, quiet and restrained, but simmering, like a man who had rehearsed a speech too many times and wasn't sure when to deliver it. Later that evening, while I helped my mother put away dishes, she said, "You know, I never imagined you'd still be alone at 40. I kept my back to her. "Maybe I'm not as alone as you think." She sighed. "You were always so good at keeping secrets." It's not a compliment, Nat. I wanted to tell her that the man I had married understood me in ways no one else ever had, that his absence was intentional, that protecting someone sometimes meant staying invisible. But I didn't, because in that house, truth was just another foreign language. That night, lying in the old guest room, same quilt, same peeling posters on the wall, I stared at the ceiling and thought, something is off. He knows something. He's planning something. I wasn't wrong. I just had no idea how far he had already gone. After dinner, the house grew quiet in that particular way families do when the small talk runs dry and everyone simply waits for the others to leave. My mother retreated to her crossword puzzles. Aunt Beth watched a rerun of Jeopardy at low volume. The cousins disappeared into the guest room, giggling over something on a phone screen. That was when Christopher appeared in the hallway, 2 glasses in hand. "Come on," he said. "Let's have a drink. Just the 2 of us." We stepped out onto the back porch. The November air was sharp, but not brutal. He handed me a glass of bourbon. Neat, the way our father used to drink it. The porch hadn't changed. Same splintered railing, same wind chime that hadn't functioned properly in years. Even the outdoor light hummed with that faint buzz, like a memory trying to resurface. He leaned against the post. I stayed standing. "You ever miss it?" he asked. "Being home. Depend on the day," I said. He chuckled, a dry, rehearsed sound. We sipped in silence. Then, with that same overly casual tone he used to use when he caught me sneaking cookies at night, he said, "You know, I've been meaning to ask you something." I didn't respond. I knew that tone far too well. "Is it true," he continued, "what they say about you, that you've been deployed to conflict zones?" I raised an eyebrow. "You mean have I ever been to a war zone?" He nodded. "Yeah. I mean, the official story is always so vague. You never post anything, never write, never call. Sometimes it feels like you don't even exist." I sipped the bourbon slowly. "Maybe that's the point," I said. He smirked, though there was no warmth behind it. "So, boots on the ground, Or were you just sitting in some air-conditioned base writing reports? I didn't blink, didn't flinch, just looked at him. Silence. He waited for an answer that never came. I had long since learned that when someone asks a question that isn't really a question, it's a challenge. And the best response is none at all. Christopher took another sip, then fixed his gaze on the darkness beyond the yard. You know, he said, I've seen a lot of my line of work. Fraud cases, stolen valor, forged orders. You'd be surprised how many people fabricate clearance to get ahead. He didn't look at me when he said it. Didn't need to. I set my glass down on the porch railing. Good night, Chris, I said and walked back inside. I didn't turn to see if he was watching. Later that night, as the house settled into sleep, Christopher stood alone in the garage with the lights off. He held his phone to his ear and spoke in that clipped, official cadence I'd heard him use in courtrooms. Yes, he said. It's confirmed. She's here tomorrow night. A pause. We'll proceed after the ceremony begins. In front of everyone. Another pause, a slow breath. No, she doesn't know. A muffled voice replied on the other end. Christopher's tone dropped lower, colder. She thinks she's untouchable, that no one's watching. But I've seen the files, the inconsistencies. I've been building this case for over a year. The voice on the other end said something inaudible. Don't worry, Christopher said. By this time tomorrow, she won't just be stripped of her rank. She'll be exposed, discredited, and this time, she won't be able to disappear. He ended the call. No Ismail, no second thoughts. He stared at the garage wall where our father's old rifle used to hang. Then he reached into a box labeled Christmas lights and withdrew a sealed manila envelope. Inside, photographs, documents, sealed, orders stamped unclassified for review. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, the plan was already in motion. And I, completely unaware, was still upstairs brushing my teeth, trying to rehearse what I'd say in my speech the following night. The speech I never got to deliver. Because the man in that garage was no longer simply my brother. He was my accuser, and I was already on trial. I had barely touched my wine when the atmosphere in the room changed. It happened quickly, like a wave rolling over a calm shore. One moment, people were applauding, toasting, laughing. The next, the air went rigid, as though something had fractured just beneath the surface. Christopher stood up. His uniform, sharp and gleaming, caught the chandelier light at precisely the right angle, making him look even more decorated than usual. He moved to the center of the banquet hall and cleared his throat. The microphone hadn't been offered to him, but someone passed it along anyway, likely assuming it was a heartfelt toast from a proud older brother. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, before the ceremony proceeds, there is something that must be seen. The audience fell quiet. Wine glasses paused midair. I sat frozen, smile half raised. He reached into a slim leather folder and removed a set of documents. This is the real story of Natalie Vance, he said. Or should I say, Natalie Morgan? A wave of murmurs. One of my former instructors coughed. Someone at a nearby table let out a nervous laugh. Christopher pressed a button on the clicker in his hand. Behind him, the projection screen flickered on. The first slide, an ID badge, black and white, low resolution. The name, Morgan, in the photograph was of me, though not one I had ever seen. Hair pulled back, no rank visible, no insignia. Eyes like ice. Multiple aliases, Christopher said. Multiple deployments under different names. Her current title, rank, and clearances may not be what they appear. The second slide, a still image from a surveillance feed, showing me speaking with a man in a crowded marketplace somewhere in the Middle East. This footage, Christopher continued, was obtained from a source within Naval Command during an internal inquiry. You'll hear a voice, hers, communicating in Arabic. No translator present. No formal authorization for the operation on record. The video began to play. My voice echoed through the hall. But it wasn't my voice, not really. It had been edited, stitched together, cut in ways that only someone with advanced technical capability could manage. Do you have the package? The signal is live. We move at 0-200. I had spoken those words once, but not together, not in that sequence, and certainly not in the context in which they were now being used. Still, there it was. My voice, my image, The audience leaned in, uncertain what they were witnessing. The doubts settled like poison gas, silent, creeping, suffocating. Someone whispered, "Is she a spy?" Another murmured, "Was any of it real?" The third slide appeared, a page from a deployment log, heavily redacted. My name, or one version of it, appeared alongside a mission classified 5 clearance levels above anything in that room. "There are gaps in her record," Christopher said. "No chain of command that can be verified. No direct supervisors willing to come forward. Just shadows and silence." My mother turned to me, eyes wide. "Natalie, what is this?" I said nothing. I didn't nod, didn't blink. I simply sat there, spine straight, hands folded, face unreadable, because I knew precisely what was happening. And I also knew that anything I said would only feed the flames. I scanned the room. Raymond wasn't there. Not yet. Christopher stepped closer to my table. He held up a final page, bold letters across the top. "Request for investigation. Security breach suspected. I've submitted this to the Pentagon," he said. "Tonight is not just a celebration. It is a reckoning." A gasp, then stillness. You could hear a spoon strike a plate in the far corner. He looked directly at me. "Do you deny it?" I said nothing still. Not because I lacked the ability, but because I understood something no one else in that room yet grasped. This wasn't only about me. It was about the system, the silence it demanded, the stories it erased, and above all, it was about who controlled the narrative. Sometimes survival isn't about speaking louder. It's about waiting until the right voice speaks for you. And mine was already on his way. Christopher stepped back from the projector screen, savoring the hush like a man who believed he had just won a war. His chest swelled with satisfaction, his voice steady and composed. "I've already notified the Office of Naval Intelligence," he said, "and I've contacted 2 news outlets. They're standing by outside, waiting for comment." People began shifting in their seats. Some glanced toward the exits. I could sense it, the pull of doubt, the quiet erosion of reputation. It spreads faster than truth ever could. Then I heard it. Footsteps, heavy, measured, the kind of stride that didn't request attention. It commanded it. The rear doors of the banquet hall swung open. In walked a group of 5 uniformed officers from the Navy Legal Division. White gloves, silver insignias, eyes sharp and focused. At the center of them stood a woman I knew well, Commander Ava Ling. We had once sat side by side during a black site debrief in northern Norway, though no one else in that room would know that. She held a sealed folder in her hand. Christopher turned, blinking quickly. "Can I help you?" he asked, confused, though not yet alarmed. Commander Ling stepped forward and withdrew a sheet from the folder. "Christopher Vance," she said, her voice calm but precise. "You are hereby served with a formal notice of investigation by the Department of the Navy for unauthorized dissemination of classified clearance-level materials." The room went completely still. "Excuse me?" Christopher laughed, glancing around as if expecting someone to clarify the mistake. "You distributed a restricted operations video," she continued, "to a civilian audience without redaction, clearance review, or chain of command approval. That constitutes a direct violation of DoD Directive 5200.01. He flushed red. "I didn't leak it," he said. "I presented it as evidence. An internal family matter." Commander Ling didn't waver. "The moment you projected that footage in front of unvetted guests without prior clearance authorization, you violated federal protocols. This is not a family disagreement. This is an active legal breach." A second officer stepped forward and handed him another document, this one bearing multiple stamps, signatures, and one unmistakable heading: Notice of Investigation. Navy Intelligence Oversight Board. Christopher stared down at it, as if it were written in a language he didn't recognize. "You can't do this," he said. "I'm the one exposing fraud here. She's the one with multiple identities." Commander Ling raised an eyebrow. "And all of her identities," she said carefully, "are protected under Tier 1 classified operations, validated through a joint agreement between Naval Intelligence and the Office of Counterintelligence Operations. You, however, acted alone." A stunned murmur swept through the crowd. He spun toward our mother. "Mom, you saw the video, right? You heard what she said. That wasn't normal. Mom didn't respond. A few seats away, someone muttered, "This just completely flipped." And it had, because suddenly the room was no longer a courtroom with Christopher as prosecutor. Now, he was the one under the spotlight. One by one, the guests who had been staring at me shifted their attention to him. I didn't move, didn't smile, didn't blink, just held his gaze. He opened his mouth again, likely to object, but Commander Ling cut him off. "You have the right to file a rebuttal. But from this moment forward, you are under administrative observation. Any further contact with the press will constitute obstruction of inquiry." Two officers took positions on either side of him, not touching, but close enough to send an unmistakable message. "You're no longer in control." He stared at me from across the room, and for the first time in his life, he looked small, cornered, and afraid. I slowly rose from my seat, still said nothing. But in that moment, I could see it in his expression. He had finally realized that the game he had set in motion was far larger than he had ever understood. Because what he had tried to use against me, clearance, secrecy, silence, wasn't merely my burden. It was my armor, and he had just struck it with bare hands. The instant Commander Ling and her officers departed, the noise began. Not from the Navy, from the family. Chairs scraped across the floor, silverware clinked, voices rose like smoke. First hushed, then desperate. I was still on my feet when my mother approached, eyes red, lipstick faded, hands wringing a napkin as though it might yield answers. "Natalie," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just tell me the truth. Please." I stayed quiet, listening. "Are you really who you say you are? Or was your brother right? All those years, all those absences, were they lies?" Her words didn't strike the way they should have. They landed more like a bruise you had already anticipated. She stepped back, wiping her cheek. "I don't even know what to believe anymore." Then Aunt Beth chimed in, arms crossed, judgment already settled. "You were always too quiet, Natalie. Always away, always somewhere mysterious." It made us all uneasy. She glanced at the others at the table, searching for agreement. We never asked directly, but we always wondered, what kind of life is that? No photographs, no holidays, no husband. It's simply not normal. I felt as though I were watching them perform from a script I had never auditioned for. They weren't genuinely seeking answers. They were rewriting history to suit their comfort. I didn't argue, didn't defend myself, because none of them were after clarity. They wanted certainty, and that had never been something I could offer. So I slipped away through the hallway, past portraits I no longer recognized. Outside, snow was falling, quiet and unapologetic. I stood beneath the porch light, barehanded, breath clouding in front of me. The cold was a relief. It felt clean and honest. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, bracing for more accusations. But it was Lucy, my cousin, barely 20, gentle-voiced and kind, the only one who had ever written to me during deployments, even when the letters never came back. She held her coat closed with one arm, the other extending a steaming mug toward me. "Cocoa," she said, "the real kind." I accepted it without a word. We stood side by side, watching snowflakes drift down onto the frozen yard. Then she said quietly, "I don't know what happened in there. I don't understand half of what was said, but..." She paused, her voice barely above a breath. "I believe you." I looked at her. "Why?" She shrugged. "Because you didn't flinch. Not once. You didn't defend yourself. Not because you couldn't, but because you didn't need to." That landed harder than I expected. Everyone in there, she added, wanted an explanation that made them feel comfortable. Not the truth. That's what frightened them. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "You're braver than all of them, you know," she said. I smiled just slightly. "No, I'm just used to cold rooms." She chuckled softly. We sipped cocoa together in silence. Then she said, "Whatever happens next, I want to help." "There's nothing to help with," I told her. "Still," she said, "I want to be there. You shouldn't have to be alone for doing something that matters, even if they can't understand it." Those words stayed with me, not because they erased everything that had happened, but because they reminded me that sometimes the smallest voices carry the deepest faith. Inside the house, my mother was still weeping. My aunt was still whispering. Christopher was likely stewing alone in a locked room, replaying everything he had lost. But out here, there was only snow and cocoa, and a girl who still believed in me, even when the rest of my family did not. Sometimes family isn't defined by a shared name. It's defined by who shares your silence and still chooses to stay. The snow followed us as we drove. Raymond hadn't spoken a word since I'd gotten into the car. His hands rested on the wheel, not tense, but steady, as though he were containing something powerful. The streets of Annapolis were silent and cold. It wasn't until we passed the old naval bookstore that he finally broke the quiet. "You held the line tonight." I didn't respond. I just watched the streetlights flicker against the windshield. I read the entire file, he continued. Everything Christopher assembled. Every clip, every record he tampered with. He drew a slow breath. He didn't even understand what he was looking at. He thought he'd found a scandal. He didn't realize he was stepping through a cemetery. That line cut through me like a splinter of ice. Because he was right. There were 3 names in that file. 3 faces, 3 operatives. All 3 were dead. Not because of me directly, but because of a misstep made months prior. A data packet misrouted through an unverified channel. The channel Christopher had once urged me to use in order to save time. And I had used it. I closed my eyes. "If I tell the truth," I whispered, "3 funerals will become public." Raymond nodded slowly. "And if you don't, your name may never be cleared. The whispers will continue. Your mother will keep doubting. Every medal you've earned will gather dust beside shame." He glanced at me briefly. "So I have to ask, what do you want?" The question felt too vast for any answer. I looked out the window again. A child was walking their dog along the sidewalk, bundled in a scarf far too large for their frame, completely oblivious to secrets, to bloodlines, to wars fought behind locked screens and unmarked graves. "If I speak," I said, 3 lives will be disinterred but not honored, just exposed. Their families will receive nothing but questions, headlines, and shame. I added quietly, "And if I stay silent, my family believes I'm a liar, that I betrayed the flag, that I fabricated my entire career." Raymond exhaled heavily. "So which truth carries more weight?" That was when I turned and looked at him, not as his wife, not as the officer he had once protected, but as a woman who had lived alongside ghosts for too long. "Let them think I'm a fraud," I said. "Let them whisper. Let them call me a fake. I can carry that." I looked down at my gloved hands. "But I won't let anyone know who really died or why." He turned to face me fully, one hand still on the wheel, the other resting on the gear shift. "Natalie, you don't owe your brother protection." "It's not about him," I answered. "It's about the ones who trusted me to keep their names buried. Even in disgrace, especially in disgrace." He nodded once, slowly, with something like grief. "I was wrong years ago," he said quietly. "I told you that staying silent made you invisible. But now I understand. It's what kept others alive." The car stopped at a red light. No honking, no traffic passing. The city held its breath. "You're certain about this?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, without hesitating. "Even if it means losing your mother forever. Better she despises a lie than mourns a truth she could never comprehend." He reached over and took my hand, a light touch, not meant to console or persuade, simply to remind me that I wasn't alone. "Then we stay quiet," he said, "but not still." I nodded, because there is a difference. Silence isn't surrender. It can be armor. It can be rebellion. It can be love, twisted, painful, but necessary. And as the light turned green and we continued into the snowfall, I whispered the names of the 3 who had died. Just once, just for myself. Then I let them go. There's a name I never speak. Not aloud, not in memory, not even in the solitude of my own thoughts. It belongs to a child I didn't see until it was already too late. It was my 4th black operation, a mission in southern Chad. The intelligence was clean, or so we believed. Our objective: extract encrypted data from a rogue satellite terminal operated by a warlord funneling weapons across borders. It was designed to be a surgical strike. 3 minutes in, 4 hostiles neutralized, 1 drive recovered. Minimal exposure, minimal risk. I was stationed offshore aboard a stealth destroyer retrofitted with drone guidance. My role: real-time decryption and sniper command. When the signal came in, I accessed the feed and surveyed the compound. 4 heat signatures, consistent with adult male profiles. The drone circled twice. Satellite confirmation arrived. I gave the green light. We fired. 2 shots, one from the drone, one from a coordinated land team. The terminal was destroyed. The drive was recovered. And then came the scream. Not over the radio, not through comms, but through the secondary camera. Thermal imaging delay. A child, perhaps 7 years old, crawling out from beneath the rubble of the rear structure. We hadn't detected him. He hadn't appeared on the heat scan. He'd been sleeping beneath metal sheeting, insulated from detection. And now he was gone. We never included him in the report. He wasn't listed in any enemy tally. No one in command said a single word. There was no inquiry, no consequence. Instead, they gave me a commendation, a medal for rapid response clearance and data preservation under hostile conditions. I declined. They called it humility. It wasn't. It was guilt. Afterward, I requested reassignment. Deep intelligence only. No weapons authority, no kill clearance, just shadows. I became the person who designed missions, but never pulled a trigger again. And every time they attempted to pin a medal to my chest, I found a reason to absent myself. Classified deployment. Urgent transfer. Unavailable. Because honors don't feel like honors when they rest on bones. Back in the present, I sat alone in a quiet room. The same briefing space at Norfolk I had visited dozens of times before. Only this time, I had brought something with me. A small, unmarked envelope. Inside, a single photograph of the compound taken days before the strike. 4 adults and 1 child standing outside together. It wasn't even operational data, just an intercepted image shared between militia camps. I had seen it before the mission, but I had dismissed it because the heat scan read 4, because the pressure said go, because I was young and determined to prove I could make a call without hesitation. So I did, and I killed a child whose name I never learned. That is why I don't pursue public recognition. That is why I never invited my family to ceremonies. That is why I remained a ghost. Some truths are too heavy for the light of day, not because they are shameful, but because they carry a weight that no explanation can ease. Raymond once asked me why I hadn't corrected my brother when he called me a fraud. Because he's not entirely wrong, I said. Just incomplete. I have saved lives since then. I have broken codes that stopped truck bombs. I have redirected airstrikes that would have leveled hospitals. But none of it brings that child back. None of it unmakes that story. So I carry it, not as a burden, but as counterbalance. Because the work I perform in the shadows isn't about hiding. It's about protecting. And sometimes protecting truth means burying it so deep that no one can ever weaponize it again. Especially your own family. It didn't unfold in a marble courtroom with high ceilings and echo. There were no cameras, no gavel, no jury of peers. It was a military tribunal, private, methodical, and brutal in its restraint. Christopher sat 3 chairs from me, uniform crisp, posture still carrying a trace of arrogance. But his eyes flickered. They always do when he's been cornered. The presiding officer, Rear Admiral Skinner, didn't address him first. He looked at me. "Commander Vance, you have the right to remain silent. Are you here to testify or observe?" I rose. My voice was even. "Neither. I'm here to clarify." The room grew quiet. "Clarify what?" he asked. I produced the file. Not thick, just 12 pages, but every one of them had weight. "Clarify that I am no longer covering for him." Eyes shifted toward Christopher. He moved in his seat, cycling through expressions, confused, offended, innocent. But the balance had already tilted. The folder contained redacted communications logs, metadata tracking a single encrypted satellite line from my base in Djibouti back to a civilian-registered router in Washington, D.C., registered under Christopher's home address. A router he had allowed a freelance contractor to access for data caching tests. That contractor worked under contract for a logistics company which had, as we would later discover, indirect connections to a shell entity based out of Beirut. 3 Navy SEALs, Maddox, Hartley, and Lynn, died in an ambush 2 weeks after that test. They had been operating on compromised codes, and I had carried that knowledge for 18 months. "Did you accuse him of this when it happened?" Skinner asked. No, I said. I buried it. Why? Because if the truth had surfaced at that time, I answered, we wouldn't have lost just one name. We would have lost trust inside an already fragile operation. And I wasn't certain it was his fault. Not entirely. I looked at Christopher. But I am now. He rose abruptly. Objection. This isn't a courtroom, Skinner interrupted. And you're not a lawyer. See, he sat, slowly. So, why come forward now? Skinner asked me. I paused, then answered directly. Because my silence isn't protecting anything anymore. And because he weaponized my record to shield his own. I held Skinner's gaze. I didn't come here to destroy him. I came here to stop cleaning up his mess. The tribunal withdrew to the adjacent room and deliberated for 45 minutes. I sat in silence. Christopher cracked the knuckles of his left hand, one by one. He always did that when anxious. When the officers returned, the verdict was delivered without ceremony. Lieutenant Commander Christopher Vance was hereby relieved of his current assignment, stripped of classified clearance, and suspended without pay pending formal dishonorable discharge proceedings. No handcuffs, no public spectacle, just silence. And silence cuts sharper than steel when pride is all a man has left. As the room cleared, Christopher remained seated. He didn't look at me, didn't speak, until I was nearly at the door. You could have stayed quiet. I stopped. I did. For 18 months. He turned toward me, eyes red, not from remorse, but from rage. You ruined me. I stepped closer, just enough that only he could hear. No, I let you walk away when I shouldn't have. This isn't revenge, Christopher. It's recoil. He blinked. Recoil. Actions carry consequences. Like gravity. You can fight it, delay it, deny it, but it lands eventually. He looked as though he wanted to respond, but his mouth simply fell open and stayed that way. I left him there. Not in chains, not in public disgrace, just in a truth he could no longer manage. And for someone like him, that was the deepest punishment of all. The letter was folded once, printed on cream-colored cardstock, typed neatly with my signature at the bottom. It rested on the corner of my desk, untouched, until Raymond placed it back in my hand. Are you certain you want to send it? He asked. I studied the envelope. It wasn't lengthy, just 6 paragraphs, professionally worded, respectfully composed. A petition for leniency. A request that my brother's military pension be partially preserved on the basis of prior honorable service, and to spare our mother one final humiliation. I had written it 3 days earlier, alone at 2 o'clock in the morning, in a moment of weakness, of habit, because no matter how many betrayals had accumulated, there was still a part of me that remembered being 5 years old, chasing Christopher's shadow in our father's old uniform. But I wasn't 5 anymore. And shadows weren't something I chased now. I walked through them. I took the letter from Raymond, held it in my palm, and felt its weight. Not physical, but moral. I thought about letting him go. I said quietly. I truly did. Raymond nodded, but offered nothing. But then I remembered Mina. He looked at me, and I knew he understood. Mina Park, special reconnaissance operator. One of the few people I had ever truly trusted in the field. She died during an operation in northern Syria, the one that unraveled after the data leak that originated from my brother's negligence. Her death was attributed to hostile miscommunication, but I knew better. I held the letter between my fingers, then deliberately tore it in half. Then again, and again, until it was nothing but a handful of quiet pieces. Forgiveness isn't weakness, I said, but truth needs someone to hold the line. Raymond's gaze didn't leave mine. He made no move to stop me, because this wasn't about revenge. It was about drawing a boundary I should have established years ago. Later that afternoon, I found myself at the small cemetery just outside the Naval Academy grounds. Section 5, Plot 72. There was no crowd, no ceremony, just a name etched in a dark stone. L.T. Mina Park. No family had ever come to claim her. She had no living siblings, no listed parents. But she had me. I knelt and placed a small bouquet of white camellias on the grave. No note, no ribbon, just the flowers. You deserve more, I whispered. Not only in life, but in memory. I sat there for a while. Long enough for the wind to rise and pull at my uniform jacket. Long enough for the grief to surface and settle. Not because I bore responsibility for Mina's death, but because I had tried to protect the one who did. When I stood, I felt lighter. Not free, but resolved. There would always be a part of me asking what if. What if I had spoken sooner? What if I had demanded an investigation at the time? But grief doesn't respond to hypotheticals. It only yields to truth. As I walked away from Mina's grave, I didn't look back. She wouldn't have wanted pity. She would have wanted accountability. And I was finally giving her that. The phone rang late. The kind of late that isn't an emergency, just hesitation wrapped in poor timing. I let it ring twice before answering. Hello. The line was still for a moment, then, "Are you okay?" My mother's voice, soft and tentative, like someone knocking on a door they used to own but hadn't visited in a long time. I didn't answer immediately. Because how do you answer that? Coming from the woman who once told you that you should smile more, because no man likes a soldier. The mother who used to ask why you couldn't be more like your brother. That same brother had just publicly attempted to destroy me. And now she was calling to ask if I was all right. I closed my eyes, let the silence occupy the space between us. Then I spoke slowly. "I'm teaching now." "Teaching what?" she asked. "I'm helping young women become the version of themselves I once only dreamed someone might believe I already was." Another silence. Not the heavy kind this time, just honest. "That's good," she said. "That's really good." I could tell she wanted to say more. Perhaps an apology. Perhaps a justification. But sometimes the most meaningful thing a parent can do, when they are decades overdue, is simply appear in the quiet. I didn't say goodbye. I simply ended the call. Some conversations don't require conclusions. They just need to exist. The following morning, I stood at the edge of the training field on base. Naval Advanced Leadership Initiative, a program I had helped build from the ground up. The wind cut through my sleeves, the kind of cold that sharpens the senses without dulling instinct. In front of me, 24 women stood in perfect formation, all mid-20s, all sharp-eyed, all considerably tougher than anyone would assume at first glance. I stepped forward, boots crunching against the frost-hardened ground. "I'm not going to tell you to be strong," I said, because strength doesn't mean the same thing every day. They didn't blink, didn't nod. They simply listened. Some days it means holding your ground. Some days it means letting yourself feel the weight before you try to lift it again. I walked slowly down the line, pausing between each woman. This isn't about proving yourself to anyone, least of all your families, your past relationships, or some officer in command who still thinks or sounds more natural than ma'am. A few half smiles cracked through the formation. It's about mastering the art of being underestimated and converting it into a weapon. Behind me, Raymond observed from a distance. He never intervened during my sessions. He once said I had a gift for transforming pain into precision. I didn't correct him. I simply used what I had. Near the end of the line, a young cadet with a buzz cut and dark, focused eyes held my gaze. Her name was Santos. She reminded me of myself at 22, fierce, quiet, analytical. "Why do you still wear black laces, Commander?" she asked. It wasn't in the training manual. She wasn't supposed to speak without being addressed. But I answered, "Because black laces are what you wear when you've buried someone you couldn't save." She gave a single nod and asked nothing further. She understood. That evening, I stood alone on the firing range. The targets reset every 30 seconds. Each shot I fired landed dead center, measured clean, unhesitating. Spent casings scattered at my feet like discarded doubts. I no longer shot for medals. I no longer shot for applause. I shot to remind myself that even when the world questions your identity, you can still find peace in your aim. Closure doesn't always arrive as clarity. Sometimes it simply arrives as quiet. And sometimes silence is the cleanest form of justice. The bench is old, worn smooth at the edges, its metal bolts rusted from decades of salt air. But it faces the water. That's all I've ever needed. I sat there in plain clothes, gray sweater, bootcut jeans, no medals, no insignia. Just a woman letting the wind work its way through her hair. The harbor below was quiet, save for the soft clinking of rigging from the training vessels and the distant sound of cadets calling out drills. I once stood where they were. Now I sit here, A shadow fell from behind. Boots too new, footsteps too cautious. I didn't turn until I heard the voice. "Ma'am, are you Commander Vance?" I looked up. A girl, barely 20. Buzzed hair, square shoulders, hands not yet fully calloused. Her name tag read Ortega. That depends on who's asking. She smiled uncertainly, clutching a brown paper bag in both hands. "They told me to bring this to you. And they also said," she hesitated, "they said you once turned down the Navy Cross because accepting it would have revealed a mission that could have endangered your team." I said nothing. I simply looked at her, let her fill the silence with whatever version of the story she had been given. "Is it true?" she asked. I smiled slightly, not as confirmation, not as denial. "The truth is usually lonelier than the legend," I said. "But legends keep people moving forward. So perhaps that's the better version." She nodded slowly, didn't push further. "Good instincts. Do you ever wish you could take it back?" she asked after a moment. "The medal?" She nodded. I shook my head. I never wore the uniform for a medal, and I certainly didn't wear it for recognition. I paused. I wore it because some people needed to come home, and someone had to make sure they could. She stood there as if trying to commit the words to memory. But words slip when you're young. You don't understand their gravity until you've watched one dissolve in someone's final breath. She offered me the paper bag. "It's from a mess. They said you like pecan bars." I accepted it with a nod, and she turned to leave. But just as she walked away, she asked over her shoulder, "Do you miss it?" I turned back toward the water. Did I? A memory surfaced, one I hadn't gone searching for. My first covert operation. Northern Yemen. Night drop. Target extraction. High risk. Before boarding, I stood alone in the empty locker room, stripped of rank, name, and identity. Raymond had handed me one last thing before I left, his wedding band. "Wear it if it helps," he said. "Leave it if it doesn't." I held it for a long moment. Then I removed mine as well, slid them both into the locker, closed the door. It wasn't about leaving him. It was about leaving the version of myself that needed to belong. Out there, no one knew Natalie Vance. Out there, I was simply a shadow, measured only by the lives I saved and the ones I couldn't. I never put that ring back on. Back on the bench, the wind carried the scent of salt and aged metal. I reached into the paper bag and took a bite of the pecan bar, too sweet, too soft, exactly as they always were. And still, I finished it. Because some legacies aren't built from honors or headlines. Sometimes they exist in a quiet moment on a weathered bench, shared with a recruit who doesn't need to know everything, just enough to believe that honor still lives in someone. And sometimes that is more than enough. They say your legacy is written by those who outlive you. But mine was written in the silence between orders. In the breath I held when I chose not to speak. In the shadow I stepped into so that others could walk freely in the light. I once stood in full uniform at a promotion ceremony, a room gleaming with polished brass and raised glasses. I was handcuffed in front of all of them, by my own brother. He called me a fraud, a traitor, a ghost. But I said nothing, not because I had nothing to say, but because some truths don't require defending. They defend themselves in time. I have come to understand that silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the only strength you have remaining, especially when the people you believed would stand beside you are the very ones fashioning the noose. I walked out of that room with my head level, not because the world restored my name, but because I had never worn it for their benefit in the first place. I have been called many things: commander, sniper, spy, wife, but the title that means the most is teacher. Today, I stood at the back of a ceremony, not for me, but for them. Dozens of new female officers stood tall in their crisp dress whites, eyes alight with a fire the world hadn't yet tried to extinguish. I didn't stand on stage. I didn't salute. I only watched. And when they threw their caps into the air, a familiar hand came to rest gently on my shoulder. "Raymond." He said nothing. He didn't need to. We had both lost too much to require words by now. Behind the new officers, the Navy flag rippled beneath a gray sky, not in triumph, but in quiet endurance. So here I am, talking to you. Perhaps it's late where you are, Perhaps you're listening over a warm cup of coffee in the early morning light, or curled beneath a blanket at the end of a long and weary day. I don't know what brought you here, but I hope something in this story found you. You're not alone. We all carry names we no longer speak, memories tucked into the back rooms of our hearts, mistakes, sacrifices, and the people we couldn't save. If I could choose again, I would still let him put those cuffs on me. Because there are victories that were never meant to be witnessed, only felt. I once declined a medal because accepting it would have meant betraying a name I had sworn never to speak aloud. I let the legend take its place instead. Because in some corners of the world, myths protect more lives than facts ever could. There are honors you carry quietly. There are truths you conceal, not to forget, but to protect. And sometimes justice doesn't arrive wearing a robe or a badge. It arrives wearing your silence, your restraint, your decision to release something without letting it shatter you. I never wore the uniform for them. I wore it for the girl I used to be, the one no one believed in, the one who was never invited to the table, but who eventually built her own. And to her, I say this: you were never invisible. You were simply waiting for the right moment to arrive on your own terms. Before we part, we'd love to know, where are you right now? Is it a quiet morning with light easing through your window, or a still and solitary night where stories like this keep you company? Tell us in the comments. We read each one with genuine gratitude. And if this story moved you in any way, please consider subscribing, not only to hear more stories like mine, but to become part of something larger, a space that believes in kindness, in healing, in second chances, and in a kind of strength that doesn't need to shout to be felt. Thank you for being here today. Wherever you are, whatever you carry, know this: sometimes the thing you need most doesn't arrive with a loud knock. It waits quietly, patiently, until you are finally ready to open the door.